the Earl's Unwanted Correspondent. Chapter 1. The Wrong Hands. The morning room of Ashworth House was Clara's sanctuary. It faced the garden, not the street, and its walls were lined with books, not the gilt-framed ancestors who seemed to judge her from the grand saloon. 2 years a widow, and the house still felt like a borrowed costume. As the Dowager Countess of Ashworth, she was afforded respect, a comfortable dower house on the estate, and a peculiar kind of social invisibility. She was neither a married woman of influence nor an unwed girl of promise. She was, at 28, merely present. Lord Ashworth had been 30 years her senior, a man of rigid principles and minimal conversation. Their marriage had been arranged by families seeking to consolidate land and influence, and it had served its purpose efficiently. He had been neither cruel nor kind, merely absent, first in Parliament, then in spirit, and finally in body, when a sudden apoplexy had felled him in his London club. Clara had worn black, performed the rituals of grief with decorum, and felt very little except a quiet, guilty relief. Now she drifted through days marked by the changing of the seasons and the arrival of the post. It was this very invisibility that allowed her to observe. From her chair by the window, she watched the world she could no longer inhabit, the carriages rolling toward London for the season, the young couples walking the lanes, the servants bustling with purpose. She was a spectator in her own life, and she had grown accustomed to the role. Today, however, what she observed was a mistake. The afternoon post, delivered on a silver salver by the impeccably trained footman, Jenkins, contained the usual fare: a bill from the modiste for a gown she hadn't worn, and likely never would, a letter from her mother-in-law, which she set aside with a sigh, knowing it would contain veiled criticisms about her withdrawal from society, and a slender folded packet, sealed with plain wax, bearing no family crest. It was addressed, in a bold, slashing hand that spoke of urgency and confidence, to Mr. Jonathan Thorne at his rooms in St. James's Street. Clara frowned. There was no Mr. Jonathan Thorne at Ashworth House. There never had been. The previous owner had been an elderly bachelor who had left no descendants, and Clara had personally overseen the clearing of his rooms. She turned the packet over. The seal was unmarked, pressed with no signet ring. The handwriting was commanding, almost aggressive in its slant. It was clearly a personal letter, and just as clearly, it was not for her. Her first instinct was to have Jenkins return it to the post, but a flicker of something, curiosity, or the simple boredom of a quiet afternoon, stayed her hand. The name Thorne was familiar. She'd seen it in the papers, attached to fiery, anonymous pamphlets that made the Tory ministers choke on their morning coffee. Pamphlets that argued for the rights of the common man, for parliamentary reform, for the very things her late husband, a staunch traditionalist, had railed against from his comfortable seat in the Lords. Jonathan Thorne was not a peer. He was, by all accounts, a radical journalist, a man who inhabited the smoky coffee-houses of Fleet Street and corresponded with the agitators whom society preferred to ignore. What possible connection could such a man have to the former occupant of Ashworth House? The old bachelor had been as conservative as Lord Ashworth himself. The letter was an accident, a simple error, likely caused by a tired clerk or a distracted messenger. But as Clara held it, she felt a strange pull. It was a connection to a world of passion and ideas from which she, as a woman and a widow, was entirely excluded. A world where men argued about the future of the nation, where words could spark change, where a person could matter beyond the narrow confines of their social station. She placed the letter on her desk, unopened, telling herself she would return it tomorrow. A week later, another letter arrived, again for Mr. Jonathan Thorne, and then another. Clara returned the first one to the post, marking it addressee unknown in her careful, elegant hand. But the second and third, she simply kept. She told herself it was to ensure they were not lost, that she would eventually discover the correct forwarding address. She placed them, unopened, in the drawer of her writing desk, next to her own bland correspondence. Invitations she declined, notes from friends she rarely saw, bills she paid with mechanical regularity. The drawer became a small secret, a hidden compartment in her otherwise transparent life. Sometimes, late at night, she would take out the letters and hold them, wondering about the man who had written them. What kind of person poured such passion onto paper? What did he look like? Did he have a wife who knew about his secret correspondence? Did anyone truly know him at all? The fourth letter, arriving on a Tuesday thick with the promise of spring rain, was her undoing. The seal on this one was cracked, the letter inside slightly visible, as if it had been pressed too tightly into its folding. As Clara moved it, meaning to add it to the others, a single sentence caught her eye through the gap. The conscience of a nation cannot be bought with a few pieces of silver, and the men who try will find their fortunes built on ash. Her breath caught. It was seditious. It was brilliant. It was written with a fury and eloquence that made her pulse quicken and her hands tremble. In all her years of listening to polite conversation, of enduring her husband's tedious monologues about crop rotation and parliamentary procedure, she had never encountered words that burned with such intensity. Before she could talk herself out of it, before the voice of caution that had governed her entire adult life could intervene, she slid a knife under the seal. The wax cracked with a sound that seemed deafening in the quiet room. She unfolded the letter with shaking hands. The letter was long, written in that same bold hand across multiple sheets. It was a polemic against the new corn laws, arguing with devastating logic that they were designed to enrich the landed few at the expense of the starving many. The writer dissected each provision of the law with surgical precision, exposing the self-interest that lurked behind every paragraph. He wrote of children going hungry while grain rotted in warehouses, of veterans returned from war forced to beg in the streets, of a nation betraying its own people in the name of profit. It was addressed to Thorne as a fellow traveller in the cause, full of strategic advice on how to rally public opinion, which newspapers might be sympathetic, which members of Parliament might be persuaded to shift their votes. It was the work of someone who understood power intimately, who knew exactly how the machinery of government operated and where its weaknesses lay. It was signed not with a name, but with a single defiant initial. R. Clara read it 3 times, committing passages to memory. Then she read it again, this time noticing details she had missed, the quality of the paper, expensive but unmarked, the ink, a deep black that spoke of careful selection. The hand itself, educated but unrestrained, as if the writer could barely contain his thoughts long enough to commit them to paper. The hypocrisy of it struck her like a physical blow. Here was a man, R., who wrote with the passion of a prophet, who understood the suffering of the poor with an intimacy that seemed impossible for a gentleman, while the Earl of Rothwell stood up in the House of Lords and spoke of the divine right of the gentry and the dangerous fantasies of reform. She had heard Rothwell speak once from the gallery during a rare visit to London in the final months of her husband's life. He was tall, dark, and icily handsome, his voice a calm, condescending drawl that dismissed the suffering of the poor as a temporary inconvenience, a necessary sacrifice for the greater good of stability and order. She had despised him on principle, despising also the way her heart had fluttered when he glanced toward the gallery. Her pen hovered over a sheet of her own paper. She should burn the letter. She should forget she ever saw it, return to her quiet life of invisible widowhood. But the words burned in her mind. The injustice of it. A man with such passion, such understanding, hiding behind a public face of stone. If he could write like this, why did he speak like that? What was he afraid of? She dipped her pen in the ink. She would not reveal herself. She would simply respond. Not to the Earl of Rothwell, but to R. She would write as an anonymous reader, a concerned citizen who had somehow come across his words. She would point out a flaw in his logic, a vulnerability in his argument that a political opponent might exploit. In his enthusiasm, he had dismissed the landowner's concerns about agricultural prices as mere greed, but Clara knew from her husband's endless discussions that the situation was more complex. If prices fell too low, farmers would be ruined, villages would empty, and the poor would suffer in different ways. A good argument needed to acknowledge its opponent's valid points. It was an intellectual exercise, nothing more. She wrote carefully, choosing her words with the precision of someone who had spent years listening to political debate without being permitted to join it. She did not reveal her identity, her gender, or her location. She signed her letter with a simple C. The next morning, she instructed a bemused Jenkins to deliver it to the rooms of Mr. Jonathan Thorne in St. James's Street. She watched him walk down the garden path, the letter in his hand, and felt as if she had just stepped off a cliff. For a week, she heard nothing. She told herself it was for the best. She had been foolish, reckless, unworthy of the trust that R had placed in his correspondent. The letter was probably in a fireplace by now, burned by a practical man who had no time for anonymous criticism from strangers. But when the reply came, her heart hammered against her ribs so violently that she had to sit down before she could open it. The handwriting was the same, but the tone was different. It was shorter, sharper, almost defensive. R thanked C for her observations, grudgingly admitted they had merit, and then proceeded to dismantle her counter-argument with surgical precision. He wrote as if he were sparring with her, each sentence a parry and thrust, and she felt the thrill of it down to her very bones. No one sparred with Clara. They made pleasant, empty conversation. They inquired about her health. They expressed sympathy for her loss. They never, ever challenged her mind. She wrote back that very night, and this time she did not hold back. Chapter 2. Ink and Ire. For 2 months, the correspondence flourished. It became the secret centre of Clara's existence, the hidden sun around which her days revolved. She would spend her mornings anticipating the post, her afternoons composing replies with the door locked and her heart racing, and her evenings rereading his letters by candlelight, memorizing the curve of his R, the way his anger could shift, in a single paragraph, to a dry, cutting wit that made her laugh aloud in the silence of her room. Their subjects were politics, philosophy, the state of the nation, the nature of justice, the meaning of honour. They debated the French Revolution. He saw hope where she saw chaos. She saw order where he saw oppression. They argued about poetry. He preferred Byron's passion. She defended Wordsworth's restraint. They discussed the novels of Mrs. Radcliffe, which he claimed to despise, but which Clara suspected he had read more thoroughly than he admitted. But beneath the debates, a current of something else flowed. He began to ask her questions, not just about her opinions, but about her. You write of justice with a personal ache. Have you felt its absence yourself? She hesitated for days before replying, and then only obliquely. A caged bird can still see the sky. It does not make the bars any less real. He, in turn, began to reveal fissures in his own carefully constructed armour. He wrote of the crushing weight of performance, of wearing a mask so long one forgets the face beneath. He described dinners where he smiled at men he despised, votes he cast that kept him awake at night, speeches he delivered that made him want to wash out his own mouth with soap. Sometimes I think my entire life is a lie, he wrote, and the only truth I speak is to you, a stranger who may not even exist. Clara, reading this in her sunlit morning room, felt a chill run down her spine. She knew exactly what he meant. She wore a mask of pleasant widowhood, of contentment with her quiet life, of gratitude for her comfortable circumstances. He wore one of a cold aristocrat, a defender of the status quo. But the man who wrote to her, this R, was passionate, volatile, and fiercely alive. He was the person Marcus might have been if the world had allowed it. She began to imagine him, not as the Earl of Rothwell, that public figure she had despised from the gallery, but as the man behind the words. She pictured him at his desk late at night, his cravat loosened, his hair dishevelled, his pen moving furiously across the paper as he tried to capture thoughts that moved too fast for his hand. She imagined the intensity in his eyes, the slight frown of concentration, the way he might bite his lip when searching for the perfect phrase. She told herself these imaginings were harmless, the natural consequence of an intellectual intimacy. She did not admit, even to herself, that she was falling in love. One afternoon in early May, Clara was in the village, making a rare public appearance at the bookseller's to collect a new volume of poetry she had ordered. As she stepped back onto the street, a commotion further down the road caught her eye. A phaeton, pulled by a pair of high-stepping bays that could only belong to a wealthy man, had been forced to stop by a cart of vegetables that had lost a wheel. The driver of the phaeton was standing, his posture radiating pure, arrogant impatience. It was the Earl of Rothwell. Clara froze, her heart suddenly pounding. She had a perfect, unobstructed view of him. He was as handsome as she remembered, his dark hair wind-tossed, his jaw set in a hard line, his tailoring impeccable even in the midst of frustration. He was tapping his whip against his gleaming boot, his lip curled in disdain at the flustered farmer trying to right his cart. A small crowd had gathered, watching with the mixture of resentment and fascination that the poor always feel for the powerful. "Must you conduct your business in the middle of the King's Highway, my good man?" he called out, his voice carrying that same cold, condescending drawl she remembered from the House of Lords. "Some of us have places to be, appointments to keep. The world does not revolve around your vegetables." The farmer tugged his forelock, apologizing profusely, his face red with embarrassment and effort. "Beg pardon, my lord, won't be but a moment. The axle, it just give way." "A moment you have already exceeded," Rothwell replied, not troubling to hide his contempt. He glanced at his pocket watch, a gesture of such deliberate rudeness that several onlookers gasped. Clara watched, her hands clenching at her sides. This was the man she had been corresponding with, this sneering, arrogant lord who treated a struggling farmer like an insect beneath his notice. It was like watching a beautiful painting being defaced, like hearing a glorious piece of music played by someone who despised every note. But even as her anger rose, another part of her watched more carefully. She saw the way Rothwell's hand tightened on his whip, the slight tremor in his fingers. She saw how he did not quite meet the farmer's eyes, how his gaze kept sliding away as if he could not bear to look directly at the man he was humiliating. She saw, in the set of his shoulders, not genuine contempt, but something else. A performance, a mask worn so tightly that it was beginning to crack at the edges. Was it possible, she wondered, that the man in the phaeton was as much a prisoner as she was, that his cruelty was a defense, a wall built to protect the vulnerable person within? That night, she wrote to R with more passion than ever before. She wrote of the casual cruelty of the powerful, the way privilege corrupted even well-intentioned people, the small humiliations that the poor endured daily from those who should protect them. "It is not enough to write pamphlets from a gilded study," she penned, her hand shaking with emotion. "One must examine the reflection in the window pane. What if the monster you decry is the very face you show the world? What if the system you fight against lives not just in Parliament, but in your own heart, in every careless word, every impatient gesture, every moment you forget that the people below you are human?" His reply was unlike any other. It came not in the usual day or two, but after a full, agonizing week during which Clara barely slept or ate. When it arrived, the letter was shorter than usual, the script less controlled, almost frantic, as if written in the grip of a fever. "You see too much," he wrote. "You have cut to the bone, and I do not know if I bleed gratitude or resentment. You ask if I see the monster. I do. I see him every time I step into that chamber, every time I shake the hand of a man whose policies I am secretly trying to undermine, every time I look in the mirror and recognize the face of my father staring back at me. My life is a performance, and the applause is the sound of my own damnation. I write to you because you are the only one who knows the lines I speak when the curtain is down. I write to you because when I am with you, if I can say with you of someone I have never met, I am not the Earl of Rothwell. I am not my father's son. I am not the mask. I am simply a man trying to find his way through the dark. Who are you, C? Are you real, or are you a phantom my conscience has conjured to torment me? Clara pressed the letter to her heart. He was real. The man who wrote those words, who confessed his fears and his failures with such raw honesty, he was the real Earl of Rothwell, the one in the village, the one who sneered at farmers and consulted his watch while a man struggled, was the mask, and she loved the man behind the mask. The realization was not a shock, but a quiet, profound settling, like a ship finally finding its anchor after years at sea. She loved him. She loved his passion and his intelligence, his contradictions and his courage, his willingness to reveal himself to a stranger. She loved the way he argued with her, the way he took her seriously, the way he trusted her with his darkest secrets. Her reply was simple, the most honest thing she had ever written. I am as real as the hand that writes this, and as hidden as the heart that reads it. The question is not who I am, but who we are together in this space we have made. Here, there are no masks. Here, we are simply two people trying to find our way through the dark. And I am grateful, more than I can say, to have found you. The next letter was not a debate. It was not a political treatise. It was a confession. He told her about his father, a brutal man who had taught him that sentiment was weakness, that a lord's duty was to rule, not to feel, that compassion was a luxury the powerful could not afford. He told her about the moment he first read Thomas Paine, hidden in his father's library at the age of 14, and felt his entire world crumble and rebuild itself in a single afternoon. He wrote of his fear, that if he ever revealed his true self, he would be cast out, ruined, alone, his work destroyed, his influence vanished. I am a coward, C. The greatest coward in England. I fight for reform with my pen while my voice votes for tyranny. I write words that could change the world, and then I go to dinner with the men who are destroying it and compliment their wives on their jewellery. She wrote back with her own confessions. She told her about the gilded cage of her marriage, about being a clever woman forced to feign ignorance, about the profound loneliness of being seen and not known. She told him about the morning room, the endless empty days, the sensation of drowning in plain sight. You are not a coward, she wrote. A coward feels nothing. A coward builds his walls and sleeps peacefully inside them. You feel too much, and you have found a way to survive without losing yourself entirely. That is not cowardice. That is courage of a very rare and painful kind. As the weeks passed, their letters grew softer, more intimate. He no longer signed his name with a stark R, but with a tender yours. She signed her letters the same way. They spoke of dreams, the places they would go if they were free, the life they might live if they could simply step out from behind their respective curtains. He described a cottage by the sea where he could write without hiding, where he could be simply a man with a pen and an idea. She described a garden where she could walk without performing, where she could be simply a woman with a book and a thought. They fell in love not in spite of the distance, but because of it. In the silence between their letters, in the space where imagination filled what reality could not provide, they built a world where only truth existed. And in that world, they were free. Chapter 3. A Face to a Name. The first Tuesday of the season, Lady Jersey's ball was the event no one could refuse. It marked the official beginning of London's social calendar, the moment when the ton emerged from their country estates and descended upon the capital for months of entertainment, intrigue, and matchmaking. For those who mattered, attendance was not optional. Clara, as a dowager countess, was obliged to attend, though she usually spent the evening in a quiet corner, observing the spectacle of the marriage market with wry detachment. Tonight, however, her stomach was a knot of nerves so tight she could barely eat her dinner. She was going to see him. She always saw him at these events. The Earl of Rothwell was too prominent to miss. But tonight, it would be different. Tonight, she would be watching R. She spent an unusually long time preparing, studying her reflection in the mirror with a critical eye. She wore her best, a gown of deep sapphire silk that brought out the blue in her eyes and reminded her she was still a woman, not just a widow. Her maid dressed her hair with extra care, weaving ribbons through the dark curls. Clara examined the final effect. A handsome woman, certainly, but not a great beauty. Would he notice her? Would he see past the dowager countess to the woman who had challenged him, comforted him, loved him from afar? She arrived late, slipping into the edge of the ballroom just as the first waltz was ending. The heat and noise hit her first. The swell of the orchestra, the shimmer of silks and candles, the chatter of 1,000 voices, all pretending to have a wonderful time. The scent of flowers and perfume and too many people packed into too small a space made her head swim. And then she saw him. He was standing near the terrace doors, a cluster of important-looking men surrounding him like satellites around a sun. He was listening to an older, portly lord, Lord Haverhill. She recognized him, a notorious windbag who had bored her husband for hours on end, his expression one of attentive boredom. But as Clara watched, she saw it, a slight furrow between his brows that spoke of suppressed irritation. The way his fingers drummed, almost imperceptibly, against his thigh, the tension in his jaw, the slight flare of his nostrils. He wasn't just listening, he was enduring, he was performing. The mask was firmly in place, but she could see the strain of holding it there. She could see the man beneath, the one who wrote to her about the crushing weight of performance, and her heart ached for him. As if sensing her gaze, his eyes lifted and scanned the crowd. For a terrifying, exhilarating moment, his gaze passed directly over her. There was no flicker of recognition, no sign that he saw anything but another anonymous face in the crowd. Of course not. He didn't know her face. He only knew her heart. Lord Whitmore, a pompous baron with a wandering eye and a reputation for unpleasant gossip, materialized at her elbow. "Lady Ashworth, how delightful to see you out of mourning. A dreary business morning. One must get on with living, eh?" He leered, his gaze dropping to her neckline with an insolence that made her skin crawl. Clara steeled herself for the tedium of polite conversation. "Lord Whitmore, how pleasant to see you." She did not trouble to make the sentiment sound genuine. As Whitmore droned on about the price of oats, the scandalous behaviour of some debutante, and his own importance in various matters that concerned no one, Clara's focus remained on Marcus. She watched him navigate the social waters with the skill of long practice. A nod here, a smile there, a word of greeting to an approaching acquaintance. It was a masterful performance, but now that she knew what to look for, she could see the cost of it in the tightness around his eyes, the slight droop of his shoulders when he thought no one was watching. She saw the exact moment his patience snapped. Lord Haverhill finally waddled away in search of refreshment, and Marcus turned, his shoulders relaxing almost imperceptibly. He scanned the room once, quickly, and then moved towards the terrace, seeking air and escape. It was a reckless, impulsive act. Everything Clara had learned in her 30 years of careful, proper behaviour screamed at her to stay where she was, to let him go, to preserve the beautiful distance that had kept their correspondence safe. But something stronger, desire, curiosity, love, pushed her forward. Before she could stop herself, Clara murmured an excuse to the astonished Whitmore and slipped through the crowd towards the terrace doors. The night air was cool, a blessed relief after the heat of the ballroom. The terrace was largely empty, save for a few couples seeking privacy in the shadows, their whispered conversations barely audible above the distant music. Marcus stood at the balustrade, his back to her, staring out at the darkened garden. He looked impossibly tall, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the moonlight, his dark hair touched with silver from the stars above. For a moment, Clara simply looked at him, memorizing this image. This was the man who had written yours at the bottom of so many letters. This was the man who had confessed his fears and his hopes to her. This was the man she loved. She walked towards him, her slippers silent on the stone. She stopped a few feet away, close enough to see the tension in his shoulders, far enough to retreat if necessary. "It is a beautiful night," she said, her voice soft, barely above a whisper. He turned, startled. For a second his public mask was down, and she saw a flash of the man from the letters, weary, intense, watchful, with dark eyes that held depths she had only imagined. Then it was back up, replaced by polite surprise and the faint smile of a gentleman addressing a lady he did not know. "Yes, it is. A welcome respite from the warmth within." His voice was the same drawl she had heard in the village, but now she could hear the weariness beneath it. She smiled. "From more than the warmth, I suspect. The company can be equally stifling." She gestured slightly toward the ballroom behind them. "All those people, all those performances. It must be exhausting." One dark eyebrow rose a fraction. "You are very direct, madam." There was curiosity in his voice now, and something else, a flicker of interest that made her pulse quicken. "I find there is little time for anything else," she said, holding his gaze. "Life is too short for pleasantries that mean nothing, for masks that hide everything that matters." She let the words hang in the air between them, weighted with meaning he could not yet understand. He studied her for a long moment, a flicker of something, recognition, suspicion, in his dark eyes. "I confess you have the advantage of me. I do not believe we have been introduced." "We have not. I am the Dowager Countess of Ashworth." She offered a slight curtsy, proper and correct. "I watched you in the house once, some years ago. You spoke against the Reform Bill." The mask slipped again, this time into a flicker of pain, quickly suppressed. "Then you must think me a terrible monster." The words were light, almost joking, but she heard the genuine fear beneath them. "I think," she said, choosing her words with the same care she used in her letters, "that a man's words in a crowded room are often not his own. They are a costume, worn for an audience that expects a certain performance. The question is not what he says, but what he writes when no one is watching." The air between them crackled with tension. He stared at her, his eyes widening slightly, his face going pale in the moonlight. The sounds of the ballroom, the distant music, the murmur of voices, faded completely. She saw his hand grip the stone balustrade, his knuckles white with the effort of control. "And what?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, rough with emotion. "Do you think a man's true words might look like? If one were to see them, not in a crowded room but on a page, written in the dark to a stranger who has become more?" It was a test, a direct one, and she passed it. "His true words," she said, her heart pounding so loud she was sure he could hear it, "would look like a conscience that refuses to be silent. They would look like a man fighting monsters both without and within. They would look like a man who signs himself, 'Yours.'" The name hung in the air between them, heavy with all the months of correspondence, all the confessions, all the love. The mask didn't just slip, it shattered. His face transformed before her eyes. The cold arrogance vanished, replaced by raw, naked shock, and beneath it, a desperate, wondering hope that made him look younger, vulnerable, utterly human. "See," he breathed. It was not a question. It was a revelation. a prayer, a homecoming. He took a step towards her, then stopped, as if physically restraining himself with enormous effort. It's you, all this time. It's been you. The woman who challenged me, who understood me, who saw through every mask I've ever worn. It's been you. And you, she whispered, tears pricking at her eyes. It's been you, the man who wrote to me, who trusted me, who showed me that I was not invisible. It's been you. They stood there, two people stripped of their costumes, seeing each other for the first time. The connection that had been forged in ink and paper, in the space between letters, now blazed between them, a living, breathing thing that filled the night air with its warmth. "My God," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I had convinced myself you were a dream, a voice my loneliness had invented to keep me sane. But you're real. You're real, and you're here, and you're more beautiful than any dream could have imagined." "I am here," she confirmed. "I have always been here, waiting for you to find me." He took her hand, his fingers warm and strong against hers, and for a moment the world was perfect. The stars seemed brighter, the air sweeter, the music from the ballroom a distant melody celebrating their union. And then the world intruded. "Rothwell! There you are! Lady Jersey is asking for you. Something about a waltz, and you know how she gets when she's kept waiting." A ruddy-faced Viscount appeared at the terrace doors, blinking in the dim light. His eyes fell on Clara, on their clasped hands, on the intimacy of the moment he had clearly interrupted, and a knowing, unpleasant smile spread across his face. Marcus dropped her hand as if burned. The mask slammed back into place with terrifying speed, the cold eyes, the controlled expression, the slight condescending smile. "Of course, Whitmore. I was just getting some air. It's rather warm inside." The Viscount's gaze lingered on Clara, assessing, calculating. "Indeed. Well, don't let me interrupt, but best not keep the lady waiting, eh, Rothwell? People might talk." He laughed, a coarse, insinuating sound that spoke of gossip eagerly shared, and disappeared back inside. The moment was shattered. The perfect bubble of their recognition, their first meeting, lay in pieces around them. Marcus looked at her, anguish in his eyes, the mask barely containing the desperate man beneath. "Clara," he began, his voice catching on her name. "Go," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her heart, despite the tears that threatened to fall. "We cannot be seen together. Not yet. Not like this. Whitmore will talk. You know he will. We must be careful." He nodded, his jaw tight with frustration and fear. "I will write to you. Tonight. We will find a way through this. I promise you, Clara. We will find a way." He squeezed her hand once, quickly, a gesture of love and desperation, and then he was gone, striding back into the ballroom with the practiced ease of a man who had spent his life performing, leaving Clara alone on the terrace with the taste of their first meeting still on her lips and the shadow of the Viscount's smile chilling her to the bone. Chapter 4. The Reckoning. The scandal broke 3 days later. It did not break in the newspapers, not at first. It began as a whisper, a rumour, a knowing glance at a dinner party, a sudden silence when Clara entered a room. Lord Whitmore, the man Clara had so rudely abandoned at the ball, had a long memory and a vicious tongue. He had seen the Earl of Rothwell, the proud, untouchable Tory, holding hands with a widow on a dark terrace. He had seen the Dowager Countess slip away moments before. It was enough. He stoked the embers of gossip until they became a blaze that consumed everything in its path. By the end of the week, it was the talk of the ton. "Have you heard about Rothwell and the Ashworth widow?" "Quite the clandestine affair, I hear." "She's set her cap at him, mark my words, a fortune hunter, just like all the rest." No, it's more scandalous than that. They say they've been corresponding for months. Secret letters, passed through servants. Can you imagine? The whispers reached Clara first, through her horrified maid, who had heard it from a footman who had heard it from a cook, who had heard it from a gossip at the market. Then through a curt, formal note from her mother-in-law, demanding an explanation and threatening to cut off the allowance that supplemented Clara's modest income. Then through the sudden absence of callers, the invitations that stopped arriving, the friends who suddenly found themselves too busy to visit. She was compromised. Her reputation, her careful, invisible existence, was in tatters. She sat in her morning room, the drawer full of Marcus's letters now a cache of dynamite that could destroy them both, and felt the walls closing in around her. For the first time in her carefully controlled life, she did not know what to do. For Marcus, the scandal was politically catastrophic. His party leaders summoned him to an emergency meeting. They spoke of propriety, of the appearance of weakness, of the need to distance himself from this unfortunate entanglement. A secret correspondence with an unnamed person was one thing. A very public scandal with a respectable widow was quite another. His enemies in the house, the very men whose policies his R letters sought to undermine, now had a weapon they wielded with gleeful cruelty. The moral character of the Earl of Rothwell, one sneered in a speech that was widely reported, is clearly not what it appears. A man who conducts secret correspondence with married women, widows, gentlemen, widows, cannot be trusted with the affairs of the nation. If he cannot be honest in his private life, how can we expect honesty in his public duties? Marcus sat through the speech with his mask firmly in place, his expression revealing nothing of the rage and despair churning inside him. He was trapped. To defend Clara was to draw more attention to her, to confirm the rumours, to drag her further into the mud. To defend himself was to betray her, to abandon the only person who had ever truly known him. That night, he wrote her a desperate letter, the first since the ball. I am coming to you. I do not care about the consequences, about my career, about any of it. We will face this together, or we will fall together. I will not let you face this alone. Clara received the letter and knew, with a terrible certainty, that she could not let him. If he came to her openly now, in the midst of the scandal, it would be the end of him. His career, his political influence, his ability to do good, the very thing that made his secret work possible, would be destroyed. And she would be the cause, the woman who had ruined the best man she had ever known. He came anyway. That very night, under cover of darkness, his carriage pulled up before Ashworth House. Jenkins, flustered and horrified by this breach of propriety, showed him into the morning room where Clara sat, pale but composed, the drawer of letters open before her. You should not be here, she said, the moment the door closed behind him. You know you should not be here. It will only make things worse. I should be nowhere else. He crossed the room in 3 strides and took her hands, pulling her to her feet. Clara, I will not let them destroy you to save myself. I will not be that coward, not any more. It is not a matter of letting them, she said, her voice catching despite her determination to remain calm. It is a matter of choosing. You have a voice, Marcus, a voice that matters. You can change things. You can help people. Those letters you write, they matter. If you are ruined over a tawdry scandal, that voice is silenced. And for what? For holding my hand on a terrace, for loving me. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears she had not realized were falling. For you. For the woman who taught me that my voice was worth having. For the only person who has ever seen me, truly seen me, and loved what she saw. If that is what I am silenced for, then it is a fair price, a price I will pay gladly. Her resolve crumbled. She leaned into his touch, into the warmth of his hands, into the love shining in his eyes. I cannot let you. I cannot be the reason you lose everything. You do not have a choice. He kissed her then, a fierce, desperate kiss that held all the weeks of longing, all the months of letters, all the years of loneliness that had preceded their meeting. It was their first real kiss, and it tasted of salt and sorrow and a love so profound it felt like a physical pain, a wound, and a healing all at once. When they broke apart, an idea was forming in Clara's mind, a desperate, reckless, terrifying idea that might destroy them both or set them free. "Your letters," she said, her voice strengthening as the plan took shape. "The ones you wrote to Mr. Thorne, the political ones, the ones about reform. Do you still have copies?" He frowned, confused by the sudden shift. "Some. Why? What possible relevance could they have to our current situation?" "What if the world knew?" she whispered. "Not about us, not about the terrace, not about the correspondence between a widow and an earl, but about him, about the man behind the mask." He stared at her, his face going pale. "It would be political suicide. I would be cast out by my own party, called a traitor, a hypocrite, a liar. Everything I have worked for, everything my father built, it would all be destroyed." "Yes," she agreed, her mind racing ahead, seeing possibilities he could not yet grasp. "But you would also be free. Free of the mask. Free to be the man who wrote those letters. Free to fight for what you believe, without hiding, without performing, without pretending to be someone you despise. The men who are attacking you now, they are attacking a fiction. Let that fiction die. Let the real man live." She outlined her plan, her voice growing stronger with each word, each sentence building on the last. They would leak a selection of the political letters, the most powerful, the most damning of the current government, to a sympathetic newspaper. Not the Times, which was too establishment, too cautious, but one of the more radical presses that Thorne was connected to, the ones that published his pamphlets and shared his vision. They would publish them as the work of a concerned peer, revealing the hypocrisy at the heart of the establishment, showing the world that even within the ranks of the ruling class, there were those who fought for justice. The scandal of their personal relationship would be swallowed whole by the political earthquake. The gossips would have something much more interesting to discuss than a widowed countess and a handsome earl, and Marcus would finally be free. "It will be chaos," Marcus said, awe and terror mingling in his voice as he grasped the magnitude of what she was proposing. "Absolute chaos. My party will never forgive me. My family will disown me. I will be a pariah." "You will be a hero," Clara countered. "To the people who matter, to the ones who read your words and feel hope for the first time. To the farmers in the village, the veterans begging in the streets, the children going hungry while grain rots in warehouses. To them, you will not be a traitor. You will be a savior." "And you?" he asked, his voice rough. "What will you be in all of this?" "I will be yours," she said simply, "as I have always been since the first letter. If we do this, we do it together. We face the consequences together. We build whatever comes next together. No more masks, Marcus. No more hiding. Just us." He looked at her. This woman who had been invisible, who had taken his accidental letters and built a world of truth from them, who had loved him before she knew his face and continued to love him after. She was the strongest person he had ever known, the bravest, the most true. She had spent her life caged, and now she was showing him how to be free. "Just us," he echoed, and kissed her again, this time with hope rather than despair. The publication of the letters caused the uproar Clara had predicted. The Rothwell Revelations, as they were dubbed by an enterprising journalist, rocked Parliament to its foundations. The letters were reprinted in newspapers across the country, read aloud in coffeehouses and taverns, discussed in drawing rooms and servants' quarters alike. They were brilliant, passionate, damning, and they bore the unmistakable stamp of someone who knew the system from the inside. Marcus was challenged, vilified, and defended in equal measure. His party expelled him. His former friends crossed the street to avoid him. His mother wrote him a letter so cold it might have been written by a stranger. But from the other side, from the reformers, the radicals, the common people who had never had a voice in Parliament, came a different response. Letters of support arrived by the dozens, then by the hundreds. Invitations to speak at public meetings, requests for interviews, offers of friendship from people who had read his words and felt for the first time that someone in power understood their suffering. He stood up in the House of Lords one final time, not as a member. He had resigned his seat, but as a visitor, granted permission to address his former colleagues. He spoke not with the cold drawl of the mask, but with the passionate fire of the voice Clara had fallen in love with. He admitted to writing the letters. He did not apologize for a single word. He challenged his detractors to debate him on the merits of the ideas, not the identity of the author. And when he finished speaking, there was silence, and then, from the public gallery, a smattering of applause that grew into a roar. The political world was too busy tearing itself apart to care about a widowed countess. The personal scandal was eclipsed, then forgotten, then remembered only as a footnote to the larger drama. Clara was never named in the newspapers. Her role in the revelations remained a secret, known only to Marcus, to Jonathan Thorne, who had helped with the publication, and to the servants of Ashworth House, who were paid well and loved their mistress more. She remained in the public eye, a footnote, a rumour, a shadow, and that was precisely how they wanted it. A month later, in a quiet ceremony in the chapel of Ashworth House, with only a handful of witnesses, Jonathan Thorne, who had become a friend, Clara's maid, who had been with her for years, Marcus's solicitor, who had helped him untangle his affairs, Marcus, now plain Mr. Marcus Blackwood, the title surrendered along with the seat, married Clara, formerly the Dowager Countess of Ashworth. There were no crowds, no announcements in the society pages, no flowers or fanfare. There was only the two of them, and the vicar, and the truth. That night, in the privacy of their new home, a modest house in a quiet London square, far from the grandeur of Rothwell House, Marcus sat at his desk, a sheet of paper before him. Clara came up behind him, wrapping her arms around his shoulders, pressing a kiss to his temple. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice soft with contentment. He picked up his pen. "Writing a letter." She laughed, a soft, happy sound that filled the room with warmth. "To whom? All your correspondents are in the newspapers now." He turned, looking up at her, his eyes full of a love that needed no mask, no performance, no hiding. "To my wife," he said. "I thought I should tell her in writing that I am hers, completely, now and always, that everything I am, everything I have, everything I will ever be, it belongs to her. It has belonged to her since the first letter." He dipped the pen and wrote, in that bold, slashing hand she knew so well, a single word. "Yours." Clara smiled, took the pen from his fingers, and beneath his word, she wrote her own. Forever. The letters, once the vessels of their secret souls, had finally brought them home. They had known each other's hearts before they ever knew each other's faces. They had loved each other through ink and paper, through masks and performances, through scandal and revelation. And now, they had a lifetime to learn the rest, every feature, every expression, every quiet moment, every ordinary day. In the corner of the room, on a small table, sat a stack of letters tied with ribbon, every one they had ever written, preserved as a testament to their journey. And on top of the stack, a new letter, written that very night, waiting to be added to the collection. The Earl's unwanted correspondent had become his everything, and the man who had hidden behind a mask had finally found the courage to show his face, to her, to the world, to himself. Together, they were free. The end. As this story draws to its final breath, I want to thank you, truly, for walking every step of this journey, for lingering in its silences, for feeling its heartache, and for believing, even in its darkest moments, that love might yet prevail. If this tale has stirred something deep within you, if it has reminded you of the quiet power of devotion, resilience, and hope, then I invite you to stay. Subscribe and step with us into many more worlds where love is tested, hearts are broken, and always something beautiful endures. Your next story is already waiting.